Sexual abuse against children unfortunately exists and is most commonly instigated by adults who are abusing children. However, there is a growing chunk of these abuse cases that are actually peer-to-peer abuse. There are things we can do to look for this and to observe this and to make sure we're setting up the right environments for our kids to stay safe. Today, we're digging into child sexual abuse, specifically peer-to-peer abuse, and what we can be looking for, how we can prevent it, make it less likely to occur, understand why it's happening in the first place, including like the topic of slumber parties, yay or nay, right? Like what are guardrails around those? And having the courage as parents to say no when it feels contrary to the culture and what's popular to do, including some great tips for how we can actually say yes more. So yay, there's some hope here, but in different creative ways to ensure that our kids are staying safe. Now, I know this is a heavy topic, but like we do in every episode, we start with the heavy, but there is hope and we end with a tip, okay? And joining me is someone very well versed in this topic, which is today's guest, Kimberlee Norris. She's a sexual abuse trial attorney and the co-founder and director of MinistrySafe. She has spent 33 years, you guys, representing victims of abuse, serving as a consulting and testifying expert in abuse cases and providing crisis management and allegation response counsel to child serving organizations of all sizes. She's an acknowledged authority in child sexual abuse issues and has trained over 5 million child serving staff members and volunteers since 2005. Including me. I'm one of those over 5 million people that's gone through her trainings as I went through the MinistrySafe training that was required for me when I was volunteering at my children's school. I learned so much after going through it that I invited Kimberlee to come on here and share more with us kind of about what's going on, how we can prevent it, and what she's seeing over her decades of experience in this topic. Welcome to Keep Kids Safe. I'm your host, Sarah Panus. This podcast is a faith-fueled show for Christian parents who want to guard their children from threats like online exploitation and trafficking and other things. Every episode offers expert insights, real stories, and family-friendly trivia to help you take practical, confident action. Because one of the most common things I always hear is, we don't know what we don't know. Well, let's get educated. Let's do this together and figure out what we can do to keep our kids and other kids safer in this world and be the light against the darkness. Today, we have such an expert on the show to give us great insights about what should we know as parents to help protect kids from child sexual abuse specifically. And as we do, we start with a Bible verse for this show. And I thought one from 2 Timothy is really fitting. And it's from 2 Timothy 1 verse 7. And it says, "For the Spirit God gave us does not make us timid, but gives us power, love, and self-discipline." And when I read this, I was like, I think this really encourages parents, and I encourage you to be bold, loving, and self-controlled, which are all critical in protecting children and setting boundaries and not parenting out of fear. And so this topic is meant to empower you and to equip you with more knowledge and more information. So I want to start with the heavy topic. Kimberlee, I've gone through your MinistrySafe training. One of the most eye-opening pieces to me was learning that a large chunk of child sexual abuse cases today actually involve kids harming other kids. Can you kind of walk us through what's going on here and what you're seeing?
To be clear, the majority of child sexual abuse is still adult to child. It's still 2 out of 3 cases. But we know currently, in terms of at least reported child sexual abuse issues in the US today, are 1 out of 3 cases are peer-to-peer issues. And we know that an element of this relates back to the reality that the average age of first offense of the convicted male offender in the US is at 13 or 14 years of age. So in other words, the convicted male offender who is convicted, prosecuted, incarcerated for molesting children in the US, the average age of first offense of that offender is 13 or 14 years of age. 85% of convicted male offenders in the US say their first offense occurred before 18 years of age. So that makes it a peer-to-peer offense. Somebody under the age of 18 molesting another child under the age of 18. So some percentage of those peer-to-peer offenses go on to be lifetime offenders who continue to molest kids on into adulthood and until they are stopped or go to jail or die. So peer to peer offenses are a real risk, a real issue. Some of them occur within family scenarios, some of them occur within the neighborhood, some of them are in school settings, in camp or church or ministry settings. Peer issues are real and ongoing. They probably have existed forever, but what we know is that they are 1 out of 3 reported cases in the US today.
Wow. Wow. And with peer to peer abuse increasing, how is that kind of abuse different from what most parents imagine when they think of abuse risk? Because I know I was always thinking of adults, which to your point is the majority, but there is this growing chunk of peer to peer. And it's so interesting to me as a parent because it makes me extra observant now of like, well, who else is going out with my kids or who am I having around my kids in different situations? Why do you think peer to peer abuse is increasing?
This is year 33 for me in this realm, child sexual abuse risk and issues. The majority of the risk is occurring because the aggressor child, the child who is pursuing this interaction with another child, himself or herself was sexually abused by typically an adult or a much older child. So the majority of it, in my professional legal opinion, is occurring because that child was sexually abused himself or herself. And that
Mm,
child is replicating that behavior with other, typically younger children. For sexual behavior between children to be sexually abusive behavior, there has to be an aggressor who's pursuing the behavior, a non aggressor who is not pursuing the behavior, and an imbalance of power
mm,
for it to be considered child sexual abuse as opposed to sexual exploration or just sexual interest between kids. There has to be an aggressor, a non aggressor, and an imbalance of power. That imbalance of power is typically age. So, in most states, if there's a 3 year age gap or greater, there is a presumption of that imbalance of power. But the imbalance of power can also be size. So, a much larger child compared to a smaller child. It can be actual mental or physical capacity. So, a child who has some incapacity who's being acted upon by a child who does not have incapacity.
mm,
What typically occurs, not always, but typically is age. An older child is inappropriately interacting with a younger child, and that commonly involves some level or degree of manipulation, secrecy, hiding the behavior. So the majority of it is happening because the aggressor child was himself or herself sexually abused by an adult or an older child. And they're acting out on that behavior with other, typically younger children. Some of it is happening because the aggressor child has been exposed to inappropriate sexual content, i.e., pornography, sometimes sexual behavior between other humans, just inappropriate sexual exposure. And
mhm.
they're modeling that behavior with other kids. Sometimes that's it. So part of this is just because we are living, as you undoubtedly know, and our children are being exposed to an incredibly sexualized culture.
Yeah.
I mean, our culture is telling our kids today you can decide what your gender is, and
Yeah.
today you can decide with whom or what you have sex with, which is, of
Mhm.
course, ridiculous. But some of this issue is related to that. Some of the uptick is because of that reality.
Gosh, gosh. Quick pop quiz, guys. First quiz of the episode here. Just make sure you were listening. What percentage of child sexual abuse today is committed by juveniles, so those under the age of 18, rather than adults? What did Kimberlee say? Was it 10%, 33%, or over 60%? Yep, it was 33% approximately, so about a third. That's 1 out of 3 reported cases. And there's even some stats that show it can be even higher. Some places like the Center for Sex Offender Management are even reporting it can be up to one half of all child molestations can be accounted for by juveniles under the age of 18. All alarming, right? I think it's eye opening to think of it, not just us as parents needing to be aware of what's going on with the adults around our kids' lives, but also the kids, the other kids that are around them in different situations. So that's obviously heavy. And we always start with the heavy. So, Kimberlee, like, the grooming process is so huge with all of this, whether it's adults or from other juveniles. So I'm curious, in peer-to-peer abuse, are there any kind of telltale signs of what grooming looks like when that aggressor is another child that parents should look for and teach their kids to be aware of?
So, peer to peer abuse is slightly different where the grooming process is concerned. And just to back up a little bit, the grooming process is the process used by the adult sex abuser to essentially gain access to a targeted child, to target specific children, typically within an age and gender preference, to create opportunity to spend trusted time alone with that child, to groom that child for sexual interaction through to lessen their sense of what is appropriate in terms of touch, communication, sexual subject matters, what they view, what they see, their interaction with even visual images, introducing sexual touch, and then ultimately keeping that child silent after the fact in order to continue to have access to that child. So the grooming process is utilized by the molester to gain access, groom that child for sexual interaction, and then keep the child silent after the fact. With peer to peer issues, typically peer abusers are opportunistic in part because they are younger. They take their opportunities where they find them. In other words, they take their opportunities where they're spending time anyway. You got to think about this. Where do kids spend time? They spend time in the neighborhood, at school, at camp, at church, at places where kids gather. Kid magnet opportunities are places where peer to peer issues are going to occur. Most of the big kid magnet locations, so think theme parks, Chuck E. Cheese, Chick-fil-A, Six Flags, et cetera, have had significant peer to peer issues. Most of the entities that had play structures have significantly modified their play structures to make them more transparent. I have a child who is now 28. And when she was little, your kid would disappear into the play structure and you wouldn't see them till 25, 30 minutes later. Those play structures have been significantly modified since that time to be far more transparent because kids were going up into those play structures and waiting for other kids to show up. And those entities were being sued for that because of the lack of transparency. You couldn't see what was happening in there. In some cases, adults were going up into those play structures.
Hmm.
So even your public park, the yellow tube has cutouts in it. That's
Mhm.
why, for transparency.
Gosh, I've
Um,
never thought about that, but that makes sense. So it's good to know that advancements are being made, obviously, to be aware and to help prevent these things. I know that your mission, Kimberlee, at Ministry Safe is really rooted in prevention. It's not about fear. And that's the same thing with this show. We're not here to scare
sure.
everyone, but it is about prevention. As we move into kind of the hope, there's hope around this. Obviously, things are being done. We can talk about these things to help mitigate what goes on. So, what should Christian parents feel hopeful about today, even in light of these heavy statistics and the information that you're sharing?
From my standpoint, as a mom, the answer here for child sexual abuse risk across the board for both adult to child risk and peer to peer risk is supervision. The answer here for Christian parents, and frankly, for secular parents, but for Christian parents in particular, is to be very present. I mean, I unequivocally and unabashedly made my home the fun place to be. So the sleepovers happened at my house. Frankly, sleepovers didn't happen for my child until she was quite a bit older because peer to peer risk is highest in three locations: any place clothes come off for any reason, any place less easily seen, and any place less easily supervised. So I know what's happening at my house. I don't know what's happening at the Smith's house, even if I think I know the Smiths really well. I don't know who happens to be visiting the older brother of the Smith daughter. I know what's happening at my house. And I don't mean that to sound fearful. I mean that to sound just like how it sounds. I know what's going on at my house. So I made my place the place to gather. And my daughter's classmates, frankly, were the great beneficiaries of the fact that my house was the fun place to be. And my daughter's classmates' parents made a lot of assumptions and presumptions about our house and what was going on there, and that it was the uber fun and very safe place to be, in part because of what we do for a living. I'm married to my law partner who also does what I do for a living. So I think one answer is be very present. Don't be the drop off mom or dad. It means be involved with your child. Drop in unexpectedly. Check the programs out that your kids are involved in. See what their policies are. See what they have in place. See what their training is like. See if they are aware of this risk and have policies in place. See what their screening practices are like. It means ask questions. And if they don't have good protocols in place and you still want to do it, then volunteer and be involved yourself, because then you know what's going on. But really, the answer is be the place where the kids gather. And that's what we did.
Follow-up question onto something you just said, because it's a hot debate, I know, is sleepovers in general. You mentioned you waited until your kids were older. What would you recommend about sleepovers? I have a 10-year-old daughter, I have a 13-year-old son, and I have been very anti-sleepovers. I've let my daughter do one to date with someone I trusted and know very well. But there is more pressure I'm noticing, especially for my daughter as she's getting older. Is everyone in their class always wants to do sleepovers. It just makes me uncomfortable knowing what I know. So what do you recommend?
This is an unpopular stance, but I cannot tell you how many circumstances I encounter in my law practice that relate to sleepovers, largely because if you're going to do it, again, I took the position that most of them are going to occur at my house because I know what's happening at my house. And of course, the people who were allowing their kids to come to my house could ask all kinds of questions about what's going on at my house. Very few of them did, because they don't have the same concerns that I do. The issue here is, even if you know Mrs. Smith very well and you feel like you know Mr. Smith very well, you don't know who else is in the home. You don't know what uncle is visiting. You don't know the older brother's friend who happens to be there. And those are the scenarios over which you have very little control. So if you're going to do it, you have to be willing, in my opinion, to ask questions like, who else is going to be in the home? And if you're not willing to ask those kinds of questions because that feels awkward, then your answer should be, you shouldn't be willing to risk your child's health and welfare. To me, this is an issue of the downside for being wrong is so huge, and the ramifications for the potential damage is so massive. And this is not fear mongering, it's just reality. It's so massive for the downside of being wrong and the damage that stems from being wrong. I mean, just be willing to say no. My perspective is, as a mom, I'm the grown up, and it's my job to protect my daughter. And I'm not going to do it perfectly, but it's a responsibility that God has given to me and my husband. And these are parameters that I'm going to do the best I know how. These are responsibilities that I'm going to undertake the best that I know how. And I guess I had the benefit of, I am the fun mom, and we created all kinds of fabulous opportunities for her to have all kinds of fun in our environment, had people over. She had her first opportunity to sleep away someplace else when she was in late junior high in the 8th grade. And that was in a carefully vetted context where I asked all those questions. If you're not willing to ask, then the answer's got to be no.
I want to build on this because when we talked before this interview, you were saying that you see too many parents who are just afraid to say no. They're afraid to discipline or supervise or restrict access because they don't want to be mean. They want their kids to like them. But the reality is we are their parents and we do have to keep them safe. I just want to talk about that because sometimes you do feel like the bad guy when you have to say no all the time to your kids and they're guilt tripping you or whatever may come along, right? But From your perspective, I think this will help give us that extra courage, parents here, right? As we think about how we protect our kiddos, is saying no sometimes is the most loving thing we can do to keep them safe. What would you add to that, Kimberlee, for any parent who's like, gosh, it's just so hard. I'm always saying no to my kid and they're really asking for all these things and I don't want to feel like the bad guy. What would you say to that parent right now?
Yeah. So I would find ways to say yes that are extraordinary, that are outside the lines of the things that they're asking for, that you have to say no to. So I found ways to say yes. We threw dance parties in our backyard. We
Fun.
found ways to say yes that were rather extravagant in terms of what would be fun, but I did not say yes in ways that I knew would be dangerous to her. And one of the things that you and I talked offline about was things like phone use. I monitored my child's phone use, and we had her on a technological system. And I told her so. Hey, I own this device. We will be checking it periodically. You need to let your friends know. No expectation of privacy on this device. Let them know your parents periodically check what's on your phone, because that is a way that our children are lured into inappropriate interaction with others. In my daughter's case, there was some interaction occurring that she didn't even know what it meant, but it ended up being a very protective thing for her because she could tell her friends, hey, don't send me that stuff because my parents might see it. And so I think having the willingness to say no to our kids, let's just be frank, the inmates have no business running the asylum. Where
Mm-hmm.
did we get to a place in our culture where we became afraid to say no to our kids? Why, at what point did we think that these individuals with itty bitty brains were equipped to make decisions for themselves that would keep them safe? That's just unwise. They're lovely humans, but they do not have fully formed brains. And it is our job to keep them safe. It's our job to save them from themselves to some degree. And it is clearly our responsibility before the Lord to take steps, even if unpopular steps, to run against the curve that might be what our children would like to do or would like to follow the crowd into, that is not safe for them to walk that direction. And it may be countercultural, and that's okay. As my daughter went to college, she was a really bright girl, was in the honors program at a major university, and without exception, 90% of the girls in the honors dorm that she encountered had been sexually abused. And this was the cream of the crop.
Wow.
And she was shocked and horrified by what she encountered in this environment, and came back to me and said, Mom, I just had no idea. I thought everybody came from a safe home. And was very thankful after the fact. No, she was thankful along the way. She didn't kind of buck against it a whole lot. But again, I think part of the answer is open lines of communication, find ways to say yes in ways that are safe. And one element that I put in play with my child was we had a system of a respectful appeal. A part of this is because I'm a lawyer. But
Yep.
if she felt like some answer that I or we gave was unfair, and what kid doesn't think something is, I mean, every
Sure.
child thinks something is unfair.
Yep.
We had a system where she could come back to us and make a respectful appeal. And I would say 50% of the time that she came back and made a respectful appeal, some aspect of it got changed. Some aspect, maybe not
Mm-hmm.
100%, but she knew that was a real appellate process, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
That if
Mm-hmm.
she could make a meaningful case for here's why I would like this to be different, that she would get real appellate review and something might change. And commonly it did, to the extent that we could find a way to give her thoughtful communication another look.
I love that visual of you and your husband both being on the law side with your daughter and doing this respectful appeal. And the key there too is respectful, because as you're saying that, it's not like your daughter was whining and screaming and complaining and crying and doing the whole guilt trip thing. She had to come to you meaningfully and explain, make a meaningful case of why she wanted things to be different, which is also helping her with her decision making and her thought process and just helping with her communication skills along the way. Thank you for sharing that, because I think that's a great example of how we can continue to be helping our kids develop and grow in a respectful way.
That spilled over to her peers, by the way. They learned when they were interacting with me that they needed to come to me and say, Mrs. Love, which is my married name, I have an issue. Coming to me to complain would get them nowhere, but they could say, Mama Love, I have an issue.
Let's insert quiz number 2 for everyone listening. What's one of the most common ways a child gains early exposure to pornography? Is it A, school health class, B, from another kid's device, or C, social media ads? The answer is B, from another kid's device, unfortunately. Kids often view porn for the first time at a friend's house or on another child's phone or tablet, which really supports, as Kimberlee mentioned, tapping into their phones, making sure you have access on those devices so that you see what is being shared. You can look at internet search history if your kids have internet access. There's a lot of ways we can try to help monitor that to keep it safer for our kids and for their mental development. There's different phones out in the market now that have all sorts of parental child settings. I use a phone from TrueMe. Bark also has another one. Those are the 2 top ones that I've seen. But with TrueMe, my 13-year-old now, it's a smartphone, but he does not have any internet access. So he can't get onto social. He can't do those things without my approval unless I were to unlock those things. But he can text, he can call, he can share photos and images and things with his friends, but I can log into the parent dashboard and see everything. As we start wrapping up here, Kimberlee, you've already given us so many great tips around open communication, find ways to say yes in fun ways. I'm totally going to take that one because I feel like I'm saying no all the time. So I love that idea of saying yes in fun ways. I also love that make a respectful appeal and talking through that way and not being afraid to say no and to have that guidance and to have that open communication. If you could challenge every parent listening today to do one thing this week to reduce the risk of abuse, especially peer abuse, what would that one thing be?
Supervision. Show up, be present, don't zone out, and educate yourself.
And Kimberlee has some great resources to share with you to help you get educated around this topic even more beyond this podcast episode. First, go to their website at MinistrySafe.com. There's all sorts of resources there. Some of them are free, some of them are paid. But Kimberlee, just for all of my listeners here at Keep Kids Safe, is offering free access to a awareness training that's aimed at parents. Normally you have to pay for this. So if you send an email to Kimberlee, I will put the link to her email in the show notes here, but it's the letter K, the letter D, Norris, Norris, at lovenorris.com. Tell her you listen to Keep Kids Safe and you're interested in the free parent awareness training. So you can get that to learn even more about this topic. So special thanks to Kimberlee for sharing and giving us access to that here through the Keep Kids Safe podcast. In that training, it talks to parents about what you should be thinking through to protect your own child from sexual abuse, from adult to child or peer-to-peer issues. And that training ends with a pretty frank discussion between Kimberlee and her now adult daughter, talking about her daughter's experience growing up in a home where this was a topic that got a lot of discussion because both of her parents practice this type of law for a living. So all those links will be here in the show notes. And like we always say, the topics here start heavy, but there is hope. And there's things that we can do to help reduce this with our own kids and with other kids. So until next week, God bless.